For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dhlamini. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me for Suttner's View, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
On the eve of Women's Day, a deputy minister was filmed assaulting a woman in a nightclub. What does this tell us about women's rights?
Yeah, I think it's very important that we give due weight to this, but that we don't see women's rights as only related to protection from violence, because it's much wider than that. And I want to say something about some of the issues that I think are not getting enough attention. But in this case, you have an assault, and they seem to treat this minister very differently from you and I. Because if you and I were to have bumped someone, even by mistake, you might find yourself spending the night in the police station. And if it's a Friday, you will only come back on the Monday. And this man is appearing in court today, apparently, and we don't know whether he will be released. Probably he will get bail, because they will say he's not a flight risk and things like that. But from what he's admitted, it's alleged, but it is also what he's admitted to have assaulted these 3 women, and there are photographs, there's video footage. But what I find mustn't be ignored is that the deputy minister said that he was subject to extreme provocation. And extreme provocation was that he claims, and it hasn't been denied, that he was called gay. Now, does that constitute extreme provocation to call someone a gay person in a country where freedom of sexual orientation is constitutionally protected? Is that an insult? Is that a basis whereby you can say that what you did was under extreme provocation by virtue of this insult? And if the deputy minister thought himself being insulted, on what basis did the complainant, if she said that, or one of the other women, on what basis did they call him gay? Was that meant to be a slur on his character, a way of diminishing his sense of worth? And all of this, I think, is rather worrying, that we allow that to pass. I'm not saying that that undermines the case against the deputy minister, but we can't just assume that if a person says that I was subject to provocation, and they say, for example, the person called me a liar, that is the same as saying I was called a gay. Being an identity and a sexual preference that you're legally entitled to hold in South Africa. So I think that's a very important thing to pay attention to. And I think the law must take its course with this case, and hopefully we will see justice done. What I was saying in the beginning is that gender rights, rights of women, are not purely rights to freedom from violence against you. They relate to patriarchy, and patriarchy operates in a number of ways where men have a status of priority in the workplace, in government, and a number of other situations. And we've got to ask ourselves how we address this. And the way in which government has tended to address this has been quantitative, that they have tried to have more and more women as directors of companies, more and more women in the higher echelons of government, more and more women as professors at universities, a number of other things. But we have to understand that getting a woman into a position empowers that particular woman, perhaps, although you cannot be sure. You'd have to examine the mechanisms for decision-making in the particular place where women enter. But it doesn't necessarily empower other women, because if you go into a patriarchal institution, you may conduct yourself in the same way as other patriarchal men in relation to the entry of other women into potential positions of power. So you've got to look at this phenomenon, which I would call patriarchal women. Well, I've got it from my wife, Monizu Gasa. It's a notion that patriarchy can be practiced also by women. I mean, it's logical also in lesbian and gay relationships that one of the partners can play out a patriarchal relationship. But in all relations between women where there is an element of power, the person who is the dominant person can choose to exercise that power in a way that empowers others to transform the relationship in a way that they can grow and become empowered, or alternatively, one that diminishes them.
So what do you think should be done now to heighten awareness and advance gender equality?
You know, the way we look, the way we behave in South Africa today is that we look to government to deliver. That government must do this and government must do that. Now, I'm not saying we must stop demanding of government that government does what it is duty bound to do in terms of the law. However, in the 1980s, we used to have a number of women's organizations. We had a number of civic organizations. We had student organizations. Some of these organizations within them had women's sections. And after 1990, a lot of these organizations of civil society, we'll call them, or social movements, were actually dissolved because many people felt, well, the ANC is back, and now what we want to do as women, we can do in the Women's League, ANC Women's League, things like that. Now, the ANC Women's League has shown itself to not really be a feminist organization. It sees itself as an auxiliary force in support of the president of the time. It doesn't advance ideas that are really gender sensitive and so forth. But even if it were doing so, I think it's important to have women's organizations. I'm not talking about NGOs. NGOs can exist and can help these things, and it's very important. However, a social movement has members. NGOs don't have members. They may have resources, but we need, there used to be Cape women's organizations, Voice of the Women, and a number of other organizations, KZN, a number of other parts of the country. And previously there was the Federation of South African Women, Federation of Transvaal Women. We need organizations like that to drive the gender equality agenda and to bring in people, because another reason why it is important to not leave it to government is that the needs of women are not the same. You are all women in this room here, 2 women in this room here, and 1 woman facing me, and your conditions are not the same as, or your background, the number of people that you have to support and all of that will be different from some women in Sane, for example. And we can't forget that being a white woman, being an African woman, being a colored or Indian woman is not the same. Equally, being a woman who is unemployed or is living in a shack or is earning very little is different from a woman who may be an African who is earning enough to make ends meet at the end of the month. So we've got to understand that the differentiated qualities amongst the female section of the population will best be voiced if they have organizational mechanisms for voicing their needs. And that is why I support the resurrection of women's organizations, geographically based, and based on a number. There may also be ones that are based on sexual orientation, a number of other reasons, or disabled women and things like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about difficult questions in Women's Month.